Today I'm going to give you a concise history of the stock market since 1971, or 1974 to be a bit more precise. Bona fide investors in the US stock market think they are making money by funding America's win-win industries. But as of late 1974, they weren't investors at all. They were speculators. When I first entered the business in the late 70s, nobody told me this. Nobody even knew it. No books had been written about it, or articles in glossy magazines. Everyone thought they were so-called investors. But they weren't. They weren't providing the capital for real growth and prosperity. Instead, they were unwitting participants in the Fed's flim-flam, stealing money from the Main Street economy and transferring it to the moneyed Wall Street-oriented elites, courtesy of Richard Nixon a few years earlier, who had changed the face of financial and economic America forever. Nobody realized it yet, though. I felt uneasy about this. I felt as if I was easing into the industry that I wasn't being told the whole truth. Yet I had no idea what the grim truth really was. It was actually very confusing to me, and I very nearly left the industry. Nothing that I saw as I was training seemed to correspond to what I had read about markets, all of it written before the game changer of 1971. We were all flying blind, except that most people didn't know it. Super investor Warren Buffett has said many times that you don't make money by betting against American business. An old-timer warning would have been more appropriate. Don't fight the Fed. For the last 40 years, the fix has been in. It's win-win that builds real wealth. But win-lose is what's been driving stock prices. In 1971, the Feds replaced the old dollar with the new dollar. Alike in every other respect to the old one, the new dollar had one critical difference. It had wings. The old dollar was weighed down by gold. It could never get off the ground. It was limited by time and resources. If you wanted more dollars, you had to earn them, the old-fashioned way, by providing goods and services. That was how the mainstream economy worked. It created wealth, and the people who created wealth earned dollars. The old dollar helped make America the biggest exporter in the world, with an unbroken chain of export surpluses reaching back more than 100 years. But the new dollar could be obtained without satisfying a single customer. It was not earned on Main Street. Instead, it was created by the credit industry on Wall Street. Nor was it limited to the wealth the economy could produce. The banks, aided and abetted by the Fed, were able to create all the dollars they wanted by lending money at easy rates. An economy or a household can only support a limited amount of debt. Historically, America's relationship of debt to GDP was 1.5. That is, for every dollar of revenue, the economy could comfortably support $1.50 in debt. In an honest economy, there are only two sources of purchasing power. Either you spend your own income, past or present, or you borrow someone else's savings. This naturally limits the amount of spending. People don't earn an infinite amount of money, nor do they save an infinite amount. Credit or debt cannot exceed the amount of savings available, with an allowance for the elasticity of the fractional banking system. There is a further limitation. People lend their savings out, carefully at interest rates that give them a decent return on their money and protect them from the risk of loss. Pre-1971, the system was self-regulating. If consumers borrowed too much money, the pool of savings dried up. Interest rates rose, lenders stiffened their backs, consumers had to cool it. Internationally, the same feedback loop kept accounts in balance. If Americans bought too many goods from overseas, foreign banks showed up at the Treasury demanding gold in exchange for their paper dollars. The Treasury dutifully honoured its obligations as it had done for at least 6 generations. But this reduced the supply of gold upon which the dollar rested, in effect reducing the available money supply and forcing up interest rates. The resulting correction dampened consumer appetites, shifted the trade deficit to a surplus, and allowed the money supply to recover. The new money system didn't need no stinking savings, or caution, or market-discovered interest rates. The Fed could create as much new credit as it wanted and lend it out at almost whatever price it cared to put on it. This changed everything. Americans could spend much more overseas than they earned by selling goods to the foreigners year after year. The total accumulated deficits from 1971 to the present totaled to nearly $20 trillion in today's money. Debt soared to the rafters and then went through the roof. US government debt, for example, rose from less than $1 trillion when Ronald Reagan took office to more than $20 trillion today. Total debt rose similarly. From 1.5, the debt-to-GDP ratio rose to 3.5. Today's GDP is around $20 trillion. At the historic ratio, the economy could support $30 trillion of debt. Instead, it has $68 trillion. This gives us a measure of how out of whack the whole system has become, and it also gives us a hint of what kind of adjustment would be necessary to bring it back into whack. About $38 trillion of debt, debt-fueled asset prices, and debt-driven GDP would all have to disappear. Excess debt, made possible by the fake dollar and the Fed's easy money policies, flattered and distorted prices throughout the economy. Corporate sales were fattened by $38 trillion worth of excess spending over the 4-decade-long period. Corporate profits were favoured even more. Typically, corporations earn money and pay wages. The wages are what consumers use to buy corporate products. Wages are usually a major business cost. But this new spending came from neither savings nor from wages. It came from borrowing fake money. Corporate profits rose as companies got extra income with no offsetting wage expense. The entire stock market rose up as if on a cloud of deadly gas. Fake money, phony profits, counterfeit interest rates all swirl together in a noxious ball of highly volatile fumes. Now the Fed, reversing 30 years of policy, strikes a match. After its artificially low rates and its quantitative easing, it intends to engineer a soft landing using its quantitative tightening policy. It is bound to blow the whole system sky high. "20 years ago, the dot-coms were running wild. Trouble was clearly ahead. There was no good reason why these companies, which had no real business plan, no revenues, and no assets, should suddenly be worth so much money. It was impossible to understand what was behind it. People didn't want to hear about the downside. Many had staked their financial futures on these fast-moving tech companies. Many believed these companies represented something so new that the old investment rules no longer applied. It was obvious then, as it is now, that there was something going on beyond traditional finance. Markets always go up and down, but this was extraordinary. From 1990 to 2000, the Nasdaq had gone up by a factor of 12. Fake money had already been around since 1971. Alan Bubbles Greenspan had shown in 1987 that he would use the Fed to lower interest rates and backstop stock prices. The Greenspan put, as it was called. The Nasdaq cracked in January 2000. It lost about 80% of its value in the months following. Recovery took about a decade. But it took another crisis, a bigger one, to appreciate fully what was going on. In the run-up to the crisis of 2008-9, real estate had got way out of whack. Here again, it was pretty obvious that there'd be hell to pay. But the full implications of the fake money system only became apparent in the aftermath, when the Fed took never-before-seen measures to try to keep the system afloat. It had taken America's central bank nearly 100 years to accumulate about $800 billion worth of asset. But over the following 5 years, it added nearly $4 trillion. Whatever magic mushroom the Fed was ingesting, the federal government was soon high off too. It had taken 230 years to run up a national debt of $10 trillion. But in the next 8 years, it added $10 trillion more. Actually, the dot-com investors were right. The old rules, the old standards and the old truths seemed to have been suspended. Before the 21st century, no Federal Reserve chairman would have dreamed of adding so much debt to the bank's holdings. Nor would any have imagined he could bring the Fed's key lending rate down to effectively zero and keep it there for 9 years. Nor would any old-school Republican have thought it possible or even advisable to cut taxes at the tail end of a recovery. There's always a ready market for a tax cut. But Republicans were supposed to be the party of sensible business people. They scarcely believed in Keynesian counter-cyclical policies, let alone pro-cyclical policies that would amplify the trends rather than offset them. Now, at least, we see where we're going, and so does the Fed. Despite the remarkable new developments, markets still work in cycles. Booms are followed by busts, bull markets by bear markets, upswings by downswings, summer by fall, and a drinking binge by a hangover. The Fed, at least, has recognized the problem. It's gone on the wagon. This expansion was, until last week, already in record territory in terms of length. It's ended. The Fed will want to stimulate the economy by cutting interest rates. So it needs interest rates to cut. The trouble for the Fed is that there are limits to everything, and it appears that the economy has reached the point where more fake money lent at fake rates won't have the desired effect. The economy already has plenty of debt, far more than it had in the 70s. When Ronald Reagan entered the White House at the start of the 80s, the federal government had only $1 trillion in debt. Now it has $20 trillion. Think about it. Auto loans, mortgages, federal deficits, and corporate borrowing all depend on being able to roll over debt at the low rates. Should rates rise, whether driven by market forces or by the Fed, the whole kit and caboodle comes apart. Now, both the market and the Fed are pushing rates up. The Fed has announced a program of what it calls QT, quantitative tightening, in which it sells or simply allows to expire the bonds in its portfolio at a rate of $600 billion a year. Meanwhile, the federal government itself has cut taxes, forcing it to cover its shortfall by borrowing nearly $1 trillion in 2018. The combination will add nearly $2 trillion a year to the supply of bonds available for purchase. You may be forgiven for wondering who will buy them and at what price. Most likely, no one will buy unless rates rise to make it worth their while. Some of Wall Street's most seasoned pros are bailing out. What lies ahead is a major multi-year top in the equity markets, following the recent volatility and following the reversals to the downside that's taken place in the Dow Industrials, the Nasdaq, the S&P, and the Russell 2000. We are late in the economic cycle, and it's unusual for the deficit to be continuing to expand, adding stimulus this late in the cycle. In fact, it's never happened before. Most likely, the Feds will respond with even more easy money policies. The Fed will cut rates to zero and beyond. The federal government will both cut taxes and expand spending. This will be catastrophic. Investors at some point will again attempt to double or triple their money by buying the dip, as they did the last time the Fed went on a spree. But the economy won't recover even weakly, as it did in 2009. It's utterly bloated and saturated with debt. It's at a cyclical peak, ready for the crumbling of a great mountain of leverage in the form of margin debt and an even greater mountain of speculation, not to mention a whole continent of mindless buying of overpriced tech stocks via passive index tracking and exchange-traded funds. It's a complete reset of the American financial system. A system burdened by massive and unpayable public debts and governed by inept and corrupt policymakers. While you weren't looking, they added another $1 trillion to the national debt in the last 6 months, and in case you missed it, both houses of Congress were presented with a 2,300-page omnibus spending bill for the federal government last week. They were given less than 24 hours to read it before voting. Included are the following: a total of $1.3 trillion in spending, more than in any single year in the Obama era. $700 billion in spending on defense in 2018 and $716 billion in 2019, which is more than 36% of the global total, according to Forbes, and more than the combined spending of China, Russia, Saudi Arabia, India, France, the UK, Japan, Germany, South Korea, Italy, Australia, and Brazil. A $200 million increase in funding for the IRS, for a total of $11.3 billion in 2018 alone. $300 million in funding dedicated to implementing simplified forms and procedures from last year's tax cut, and the border wall funded to the tune of $1.6 billion for a 30-mile stretch. Does that sound like draining the swamp to you?